Welcome to Leading from the Front with your host, Tony Hunter, Chairman and CEO for McClatchy Company and founder of TWH Enterprises. Leading from the Front is a series of one-on-one conversations with diverse, talented business leaders. During these inspiring talks, Tony digs in to uncover their secrets to success in today's ever-changing marketplace and highlights how his guests lead from the front in various industries, sectors, and communities. So please, join us on learning how to lead from the front.
I'm pleased to welcome my guest today, Greg Portell. Greg's a partner at Kearney, where he's the America's lead for the consumer industries and retail practice. He's also the global leader for the firm's accelerated transformation offering, focused on quickly improving shareholder value. Greg's got more than 20 years of management consulting experience. He's worked with some of the most influential consumer-centric companies that seek his counsel on emerging topics, including rapid earnings expansion, zero-based budgeting, digital conversion, consumer marketing, and content management. Greg's also a sought-after speaker. He's a frequent contributor with Bloomberg, CNBC, Yahoo, Finance, Fox Business, The Street, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. Greg's also a friend and a colleague that I've worked with closely. Greg, welcome to the show today.
Glad to be here. It's great to see you.
Well, you and I have worked together, as I said. All of us have been on a journey. We all have this pathway to where we've landed. I gave your intro that says where you're at today, but why don't you share with my guests, how you got here and some of the chapters in your journey?
It's kind of funny because when you think about being in consulting for 20 years, it gives you an opportunity to see not only a lot of changes within consumer industries, but also a lot of changes inside consulting. In the old days, consulting was about having data, having information, and being able to spot things that others didn't really have access to. But that quickly changed as information became very available and people could really get whatever they wanted. And then it became more do-it-again consulting. And we were getting hired because we had done it before and we added stability to a process or a project. And now, as you know quite intimately, the challenge in business is figure it out consulting. So the focus that I have now is less about doing something that we've done before and more about figuring out how a particular problem can be solved for companies that are really dealing with something for the first time.
Yeah, and in today's world, we also have this disruption that, in my particular case, publishing was at the tip of the spear all along, but as you and I've chatted before, there's plenty of other people on that spear now, and there's very few sectors that haven't been disrupted. How has that changed your company and firm's approach to your consulting practice?
Well, it's actually turned quite favorable. I mean, Kearney has always been a firm that prides itself on having a group of individuals that have a personality, that are real people, and that can engage with an organization, our clients, up and down the organizational ladder. So when we think about leading from the front, that always puts you on the fringe. You're always out working with the agitators and the folks that are doing things and trying to do things a little bit differently. But at the same time, when you really talk about change and moving an organization, you have to move the core of the organization. And that's something that has always been Kearney's strength. And it's something that, as we have seen industries rapidly start to find new ground, we have really doubled down in. We love the fact that we can bring expertise with empathy to our clients to help them go through what is a difficult change period.
Yeah, I have found that having worked with you and your consulting colleagues, I really appreciate the collaborative nature of the work you do and your focus, as you just said, on empathy, but also culture and understanding your client's culture and the hierarchy and how things get done. And I have found that to be very unique, frankly, with most consulting firms. So what role do you play, Greg, as a leader of a practice at your company in terms of how you lead from the front and how you get this messaging through to your organization and continue to adapt?
Well, it really comes down to that fringe of the organization. It is finding ways to unlock energy, both at our clients and among the consulting teams themselves. So when I'm doing my job and leading from the front, it really comes down to how do you embrace the risk? Every operator in the world tries to take risk away. They want certainty, and that's exactly what they should be doing. But as a consultant, our job is to push that envelope and really find the experts in the organization that have the passion and the energy to move that organization into a way that does have more risk, but it also has more reward. So, and don't get me wrong, when we talk about embracing risk, we're not talking about being reckless and going and throwing things against the wall. We're thinking about ways that you can take measured steps to move an organizational forward. Because if you're doing the same thing you did 6 months ago, you're probably going to lose. And if you're doing the same thing that everyone else is doing, you're probably going to finish the race last. So my role tends to be to position our clients in a way that they can get that competitive advantage and position our consulting teams in a way that they can support that growth.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to talk about it because as we work together, this risk profile and how you change your appetite for risk, but only doing so when there's upside or when there's an opportunity for a big reward. And I also find that some of the things you guys are doing right now, you're in the crosshairs of disruption, right? Retail. Let's just go right to it. I mean, you talk about disruption. Why don't you talk about the issues facing retail and some of the things you're seeing emerge, as well as how you see companies handling that disruption?
Yeah, retail is an interesting one because it's got such a dichotomy of the story. We hear about the retail apocalypse, we hear about how things are bad in retail, but the reality is consumer spending is up. Consumers have continued to spend even through the pandemic. So it's not that retail is dying, it's that bad retail is dying. In many ways, it's like a forest fire that rushes through the forest, burns out all the undergrowth, and allows those new ideas to emerge. But what it requires is leaders who are willing to have that type of new growth. If a retailer is doing the same thing they did before, looking at it through the same lens, again, they won't find success. The biggest challenge for retail leaders today is that ability to make a mistake. Well, you'll read the press and you'll hear about so-and-so failed here, so-and-so failed with that idea. But from a consultant's viewpoint and an industry advocate's viewpoint, you really want those failure stories because that's how organizations learn, that's how they grow. And the best leaders, to your point, manage the downside risk associated with that. So it's a little bit like that roller coaster that goes up the hill. You always have that backstop so that if you slide back a little bit, you aren't going all the way down to the bottom of the hill.
Yeah, and as it relates to the media sector and publishing specifically, what we've also seen is with the pandemic, of course, just adding to the woes, frankly, of the retail sector, and how quickly you can go from single channel or primarily a single channel to this omni channel. And what are you telling your clients about that? Because we've seen the pendulum shift to delivery until you see your margins, and then back to pick it up at the store. And how are you seeing that evolution of the consumer experience and how retailers are handling that experience?
There's a common theme through the retail story, through the media story, through the CPG story that really puts the consumer first. So even when people talk about channels and omni-channel, consumers don't shop by channel. Consumers shop by what's for dinner tonight. They shop by what they want to give somebody for Christmas or for Hanukkah. They want to spend. And the question becomes, what's the most convenient, easy way to do that? As soon as businesses try to put themselves first and try to shape the consumer, that's when you start to see the disconnect. So the common theme that we're working with retailers and media companies with is how do you actually put the consumer first? And once you are myopically viewed on that lens, all those other decisions become a lot easier. And where you've seen companies make mistakes in the past is when they forget that central theme. So if you think about retail, the story 10 years ago was retailers trying to monetize their real estate. Well, they're not real estate companies, they're retail companies. And as soon as they started trying to monetize their real estate, they lost that core ability to be a retailer that met consumer needs. And media is very similar to that. Media companies began to sell eyeballs rather than serve consumers. And that disconnect really creates problems on the economics, it creates problems on the purpose, and it creates problems on the change, because it creates this need to your point, lead from the front in a way that breaks the traditional norms.
And Greg, we've chatted about this. The other thing I've found is people swing the pendulum so far and make these dramatic shifts in strategy. And then they got to pull back, and all of that whipsawing, not only with your clients and your customers, but with your internal employees. I tended to feel like this adapt, evolve, reinvent. And I think it jives with what you're saying is, you really need to be mindful and focused on a consumer. Are there industries and or companies that you are witnessing that you think are doing a great job at this notion of keeping the customer at the forefront and adapting and evolving versus, as I like to say, whipsawing and going too far one way?
Well, yeah, that whipsaw is an interesting point, because when you think about leaders, they need to create change. Managers just manage change, but leaders spark the change. And there's a difference between that knee-jerk reaction that you're talking about and highlighting as a real risk, and something that's a thoughtful pivot. So the thoughtful pivot allows leaders to be bold, to create change. Just something as simple as, and probably a bit cliche, Disney's move into direct to consumer is a great example of making a hard pivot into a space fairly aggressively, but also doing it with the full commitment of the organization behind it. Nobody's wondering, are they going to dip their toe here? Are they going to dip their toe there? Their leadership made the decision, they made the turn, and now are building momentum that's creating a good story.
Yeah,
Some of these.
I agree with you. The leader sparks the change, makes the proclamation, and many times the failure is also doesn't provide the roadmap or the why of behind that, right? And I think what you're describing at Disney is they checked all the boxes. We're going to make the hard pivot, but here's why, and also here's the steps we're going to take, and that allows managers to manage change.
And there's something that's really interesting about that example, in the sense that they undercut an entire infrastructure of distribution. And they did so realizing that the consumer needed the product. If you put the consumer first and don't try to protect this tradition or that traditional industry or this traditional industry, it becomes very successful. The other part of the story that becomes an important thing to keep in mind is the authenticity of what people are putting behind it. So if you look at a lot of the outdoor companies like a Patagonia, a Smartwool, an REI, they have made very clear decisions that reinforce their message of the outdoors is good, activity is good, and we're going to make decisions that cost real money, but yet support the authenticity of our brand, the authenticity of our purpose. And that is an important part of that leading from the front as well, because they have a vision, they're committed to that vision, and they're bringing organizations and their stakeholders, in this case consumers, right behind them.
Yeah, and to pivot back to our near and dear to our hearts, the publishing sector, another thing I find interesting, and maybe it's just from my vantage point, but a lot of times companies run from what they do well to chase the next new thing versus remaining on their core, not only the vision and the consumer, but what they do well and what's differentiating, and using those to pivot and to diversify. And I know your company does a lot of that kind of work. So that's the other thing that I think is an interesting thing. What do you do really well and what differentiates you? But then use those tools to pivot and to get into new sectors versus just chasing the next shiny object. So I know you have a point of view on this. We've talked about it before.
Well, we have. I mean, again, shiny objects are great if you're trying to decorate a tree. They're not always good if you're trying to run a consistent P&L. And what we encourage companies to do is look at your end goal, which in most cases, media companies included, it's consumers. Now look at your organization, look at the P&L and where you've invested the dollars. Most companies have gotten out of balance. It doesn't matter if it's a university, if it's a media company, if it's a CPG company or retailer. They've become out of balance, spending money on things that don't drive that end benefit to the consumer, in my case. And that's where we really encourage leaders to make that hard ask. If I have $1 to spend, where am I going to spend it? If you start spending it on internal machinations, you're probably making the wrong decision. And those internal games typically are the shiny objects. We build and allow organizations to build fiefdoms. It's interesting, you've been in the digital space for a long time. It's very rare to see a digital story fail because the definition of success always changes and we always want to be successful. So unlike a traditional scorecard, leaders need to allow some flexibility in how they judge success, but realize that some of that success is from learning from the failure.
Yeah, failing forward is something.
Failing forward.
Right, failing forward and being willing to do that. And to your point, making incremental bets and testing and adapting and modifying versus going all in and having a bunch of sunk costs is another thing.
But doing
experimentation. And right, exactly. And there's no better way to find out if a consumer idea is going to work than bring it to market. You can survey, you can do everything, but you got to go to market, have the guts to go to market and fail.
Right. And the conviction of belief among leaders is really an impressive differentiator. So when I work with executive teams, those that actually believe in what they're trying to solve succeed 10 times more frequently than those that don't. And it's because they understand the risk they're willing to take and they understand the value of the benefit they're trying to drive. It's very rarely a P&L benefit, although that is a benefit. It's more frequently an organizational capability, a sustainability goal, a greater good kind of comment that all comes from that willingness to put the organization behind those goals.
Yeah, we're talking about that at McClatchy right now, this notion of expecting to win and having that conviction and confidence in what you do and do well. And that's an important part of the swagger, in my view, of an executive team and a leadership team, is if you don't believe, how can you convince consumers and the folks that you're leading? And I think that's part of what you're saying here is, when you work with teams, you can see whether they actually have the intestinal fortitude or the battle-tested experience to lean in, especially in a disruptive environment.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we're in this world, both in retail and media, where everything's converging. Heck, retail and media are converging. So you have this shift of channels, shift of traditions, and really this entropy that's collapsing these industries into themselves. At the same time, so you have that disruption. At the same time, you have a consumer base that is increasingly quick to react and increasingly quick to penalize people to react. So you have organizations that are trying to run fast, they'll trip, and you have a consumer and an industry group that is really quick to penalize the company for doing that. But what's important to note is that Kearney did a survey of consumers, and it found that while 35% are willing to boycott, 90% are willing to forgive, if the mea culpa is authentic. So companies need to bring that into balance and realize that, yes, there is risk, but consumers are willing to forgive that risk as long as you're making the right steps and the right reparations.
Exactly. Research I've looked at says it isn't the mistake. It's how do you rectify the mistake and how do you treat the consumer, and it actually can build loyalty. It's counterintuitive in many ways, but it shows if you have a strong brand and your brand equity is strong with your consumers, you have more latitude, I find, to do different things, and your brand has more elasticity. And again, it goes back to brand equity, conviction, and belief in your company. So, Greg, talk. I know you run in this same circle in terms of companies that you get to work with. Talk some about that as well. I know you have you and I again have chatted about this topic as well.
Which part of companies?
The brand itself and the elasticity and the notion of the stronger that brand equity is, the flexibility and competing alternatives that you have in an industry where perhaps you're competing with folks that don't have that strong equity base in the company.
Right. I mean, again, it gives you the flexibility to take a little bit more risk and at the same time take a very introspective view of how you build that risk. I mean, you've led a lot of successful companies at this point, and how you deal with the internal norms and the internal cultures is an important part of how you drive change. We did a survey of 300 CEOs, and we asked them, what's holding your organization back from becoming more agile and driving change? And 80% of them said corporate culture. Then we asked them later in the survey, what do you prioritize when you're hiring? 80% said corporate cultural fit. And that underscores the tension point. So to your specific point of what happens with the brand equity and how can stronger organizations really take advantage as they start to move forward, it's understanding that brand equity, whether it's with a consumer or with an employee, ultimately needs to evolve and continue to grow, typically at the fringe. The universe expands at the fringe. The core ultimately has to go where that fringe is leading. So when we deal with leaders, it's encourage the activity on the fringe, but don't forget to bring that larger organization into that vision of brand equity as you move forward. The mouse going through the snake goes all the way through the snake, not just stopping at one end.
So let's just talk about culture for a second. In my view, and Drucker had it right, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And your point about culture, again, in my view, it is what makes things happen in a company or stops things from happening. And you guys, again, back to the beginning of this conversation, your company is well in tune with that notion. And how do you as a consultant play a role in that, given that you're not running the company, but how does Kearney help executives like me when you come in and work with them through these cultural issues?
Well, the key advantage a firm like Kearney will bring is we'll bring the infrastructure and the connectivity. And by infrastructure, I'm not talking PowerPoints and chevrons and software tools. I'm talking about the ability to drill down into an organization, cut through all the organizational clutter, and very quickly get an answer. When our teams supporting transformations are set up in the right way, the high functioning way, a CEO can make a phone call to me, and in 20 minutes, we can get them an answer at any level of the organization. And the answer fits that single source of truth that the transformation is trying to drive. Whereas in a traditional world, the CEO calls this report, that report down to here, this report down there. It's a little game of telephone, right? Because the organizational cultural pressure that CEO is putting on the organization naturally has cracks and fissures that make it very hard for the CEO to actually read what's going on and act. So the consulting power that Kearney brings to the equation is that unvarnished truth and the understanding of the nuances that go and flow through the organization. So it's not changing the story as it goes through those nuanced angles. It's merely letting the executive team understand those nuances so that you as a leader can then decide how do you want to push that revised message through the organization, as opposed to you reacting to a game of telephone that has changed the story 6 times as it goes up and as it goes down.
Yeah, we've seen that movie several times, haven't we? I think the rigor around your framework and the way you folks work with executives, and to your point, having one common set of facts to deal with and the linkage to the transformation objectives, I have found to be very helpful. And to your point, it is speed. There's speed in that model. So let's finish with this. We talked leading from the front, a lot around culture, agility. So what would you say to emerging leaders, those folks that are, middle management on their way to a career, knowing that the world will never be as slow as it is today, right? We think it's disruptive today. It's only going to get more disruptive. What are some pieces of advice you might give emerging leaders as they enter the next phase of their career?
I'd give them 3 pieces of advice. One that you just pointed out is remember that the world is always changing. We push our consultants and our clients in many cases to remember that whatever you knew 3 months ago is now outdated. So you have to continue to build and you have to continue to push to that fringe and that edge of ideas, of management skills, of team building. That's something that as soon as you stop doing it as a developing leader, you're dead. You can't react anymore. The second big thing I would advocate for is find your allies. It doesn't mean only work with your allies, but find your resources and allies that can help challenge you, help keep you honest, and help remind you to be humble at times, or be around when you have been humbled. But that's the group that ultimately is going to be your friends and family as you go moving forward. They're trusted, they're ready to help, and they have resources to put into the game. So that's the second one. So first one is always be moving. Second one is, remember your allies. And it's interesting because speaking of media, I've become a big fan of the TV show Ted Lasso. And he tells his team in a couple of scenes to be the goldfish because the goldfish has the shortest memory. So all of a sudden, as you get those bumps and bruises, you want to learn from the bumps and bruises, but you don't want those bumps and bruises to necessarily prevent you from taking that next step. So it's very quickly absorb the lessons from your failures and your wins for that matter, and then move on to the next one. Because again, you're always advancing, you're always progressing. So those would be the 3 quick things I'd point out.
Well, that's terrific. I talk about staying current and relevant, which really aligns well with your number 1. I talk about the power of mentors and the power of surrounding yourself with great people. You said that. And I talk about the school of hard knocks. And the only way you graduate from that is you dust off, pick yourself up, right, after failing. And there is no wisdom, as you and I know, without experience, right? And I think your point of having a short memory is a really fine point to put on that it's not failing. Failing isn't failing. Failing is staying down after you fail. And having that ability to be resilient and snap out of it and get back up and get back at it is how we all grow as leaders. So I think that's a terrific way to summarize our talk today, Greg. I appreciate you joining me today. And I'm a big fan, as you know, of you and your company and our friendship. So thank you for joining me today.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's always great talking to you.
All right. Thank you, Greg.